going to change the order a little bit, so after a few words, then we'll have the welcome for the new members today. This story is one of the few in the Gospels that are found in all four. It's rare that they have this much of agreement. But this incident or event of chasing the money changers and the dove sellers out of the temple is found in all four of them. In the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it comes at the end of Jesus' journey. Here in John's Gospel, it comes at the beginning of Jesus, and there's about 20 more minutes of theology as to why that's so, but I won't have that, bore you with all of that today. But just take it that it's a significant event, enough in the memory of the first disciples that they recorded it. And what it seems happening here is this. The money changers and the dove sellers had every legitimate right for being where they were. They weren't actually in the temple, they were in the precinct of the temple, like in the narthex, or the outer courtyard of the temple. They had legitimate right to be there because when people came from the four corners of the empire to offer sacrifice in the temple of Jerusalem, you could just imagine the example I always give. If you left Galilee with a nice white plump turtle dove that you were going to offer in sacrifice, the week-long journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, I don't think that the turtle dove is going to be white or plump anymore. And so you wouldn't want to offer a scrawny dove to God in sacrifice. So you exchanged the bird that you had brought from Galilee with a nice plump white bird that the dove sellers were selling. And so on. Especially if your currency was the common currency of Egypt or wherever you had come from, you were using Roman currency, and you needed to exchange that currency for temple currency. Because remember, the Roman coins had the emperor's portrait on it, and you didn't want to offer something that was so profane as that in the temple sacrifice. So they had a legitimate right to be there in a sense. And what happens is that you can imagine, the example I always give is, try buying gas right off the freeway compared to buying gas somewhere else far away from the freeway. You're always going to buy it at a premium, aren't you? And that was the problem. That when you left Galilee or Egypt or wherever you had come from to offer sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem, you didn't carry extra coins or money with you. And yet when you exchanged your goods for the nice white plump dove and the temple coins, you got charged a premium. Imagine if you already were living on the edge and the margin. Think of the people that Melissa described to us today. Just imagine what it would be like for them to have just a little bit to be able to buy food for their children and then come to find out that your rent goes up $5. You're not going to be able to afford that. And so therefore you're out back on the street. If you had come from someplace in the Roman Empire to Jerusalem, you would be prohibited then from going on into the temple itself to offer your sacrifice. And that's the problem. That these tables and dove sellers and so forth had created a barrier that for most of the people coming to offer sacrifice could not get across or get around. And the barrier is the problem. In other places in the Gospel, this event is described as the way in the challenge that comes in the time of Isaiah when there were already restrictions on who had access to God via the temple. And Isaiah says, "Why have you set up such barriers? This house is meant to be open to all people. That you can't limit who gets in just because of where they come from or who they are or what their background is or how much money they have in their pocket. It's meant to be open to all people. But you have now made it a den of thieves," or as John describes it, a marketplace. The intent and purpose of what the temple was to signify or what its importance had in the life of the people had gotten lost. That's in a sense what happens with the commandments. That the commandments are not do's and don'ts as perhaps as we've learned them, But the invitation is, as you hear at the beginning of them, is remember where you've come from. You've come out of the slavery in Egypt, where you were greatly oppressed, where you were not recognized as human beings, where everything about you was put down, stomped on, and almost forgotten. Remember that. And now when you come into this place of freedom, you are to create a life in this new place of freedom that is representative of God. Don't put up the barriers that will not enable you to give witness to who God is. And this is how it looks. And I always think of these things as not just spiritual realities, but hardcore economic things, right? Don't abuse your slaves. Don't force them to work when you're lounging around. Don't do these things. In other words, that the shaping of the community, according to the social structure, according to the economic structure, according to the religious structure, is to be a certain way so that when you get into that place of freedom, you will be giving an example of who God is and what God intends for the whole world. And so how they are to shape their life, well, it went up against barriers. We know when they get eventually into the land, well, they want to go back to the way it was. They want a king. They want all of these things, and they've totally forgotten who God is. Again, barriers being set up in our own lives. That if the invitation of God is openness, should be a house of prayer for all peoples. If the character of God is about openness, well then should that not be the character of our life? Openness? But what closes us down? What becomes the tables of the money changers and the dove sellers in our own life? The tables of fear, the tables of anxiety, the tables that close us off and shut us down from the possibilities and opportunities of encountering God's grace and God's love and God's compassion in the world around us. We tend to barrier ourselves, to close ourselves off when the invitation is meant to open us out into the world. And the point finally is that if our true self is in the divine image and likeness, and that's what Genesis says, that we're made in the divine image and likeness, if that's our true self, then you can see easily what we tend to, it's like coding, like I remember at home, who would paint their closet? So the closet was one color, and the bedroom was like 5 coats of paint later, totally different. So that it's like that. Here's the true self, and what happens over time is we put another layer of paint around it, because it looks good at the time that it does, and then that goes out of style, and we put another coat of paint around that. We put another coat of paint around that, until we're closed off behind walls of prejudice, behind walls of fear, behind walls. And we think that final coat of paint is what the true self represents. Well, we are people who carry around prejudice. We are people who are quite comfortable with the status quo of, the 1% lording it over the 90%. We're quite comfortable with the way things are because we think that that's what the true self is meant to be. Well, that's nothing but the false self, as Richard Rohr in his book that we're studying on Monday says. That's really not it. That's not what's meant to be for you to represent to the world. It's meant to be openness. It's meant to be the practice of compassion. It's meant to be that you hunger and thirst for justice, particularly for the poor and the vulnerable and the needy and those at the edges. That's the true self. And so what we have to consider today, as Jesus turned over the money changers' tables and chases them out of the temple, is how can we turn over the tables that we've created around the true self, the barriers. How can we turn them over? How can we chase them out so that we begin to be more the true self that God has called us to be? People of compassion, people of love, people of forgiveness, people of hope. That's the true self. The invitation is change. Change so that you represent who God is in the world.